Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you and to see you back. Some are coming for the second time and others who might be here for the first time today. On behalf of the American Experience Committee, we welcome you and hope you are finding these lectures, as I'm sure you are, meaningful and helpful in your own personal experience. And they will continue throughout the week at this excellent level. So we hope you'll be with us each day. I'm here to remind you that these lectures are supported every year by the gifts, primarily by the gifts that are given by the attendees. So what we are benefiting from here this morning is a result of people who were with us last year and made contribution to the program. So we invite and encourage you to do that, of course, for obvious reasons as we look forward to next year. That can be done in a variety of ways, including cash, check, or a credit card. And the information about how to do that, other than cash, of course, you know how to write a check, but the credit card part of it is on the information sheet that is found as you come into the lectures this morning. So, and the final part of the announcement is that this afternoon, as was announced yesterday, between the hours of 4 and 5 o'clock under the tent on the main part of the campus, Dr. Hobbs has agreed, and graciously agreed, generously agreed, to be present there for further conversation and answering of questions and sharing of her wisdom and knowledge for those who would come. So we encourage you to do that between 4 and 5 this afternoon. And then again, I believe on Thursday. Is that correct, Dr. Hobbs? The same arrangement on Thursday between 4 and 5 under the tent. So if I've forgotten anything, I'm sure Don will remind me of that when we go from there. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce for the second in her series of this year's lectures, Dr. Allyson Hobbs.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for such a warm introduction, and I just can't say enough what a wonderful time I'm having here at Bayview and just how great it's been to have the chance to talk to many of you, and I'm really looking forward to this afternoon's conversation and having the chance to engage in more discussion and more conversation. So I'm really excited to share with you today my research, my book that I wrote about racial passing, which I think is a really fascinating topic. So this is the practice by which people who identified as Black but presented themselves to the world as white. And I'm going to share my research and talk a little bit about that. Perhaps some of you have seen some of the many films that have taken up this topic, including a film last year called Passing, which I'll talk a little bit about, and I'm happy to answer questions about that as well. So I think it's really interesting how this topic continues to be a part of our public conversations and continues to be something on our minds or part of our kind of cultural interests. So I'm really happy to talk about this, and I also just want, in the spirit of kind of inquiry and intellectual empathy, I'd love for each of you to just kind of think about your identities as I'm talking, and to think about if there's been a time where maybe your identity has been mistaken, and for us to think really widely about our identities, because of course we're always skating across many different identities, whether they be our race, our ethnicity, our nationality, our sexual orientation, our religious affiliation. Maybe some of you are currently passing as a youper when you might not be. I've heard that that's a very common form of passing. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to include that in my book. And I really feel badly about that because I just should have done more research and gotten at the heart of the Hebrew. So thank you. Okay, so let me start by saying a little bit about the inspiration for this. Oops. Oh, I thought I had it too. It was like I almost had it, and then okay. And I think if you just go one more back. Perfect. Perfect. Okay, great. So this might look familiar from yesterday. So let me start by saying a little bit about the inspiration for this project. This project was inspired by a story that my aunt told me about a distant cousin of ours who grew up on the south side of Chicago in the 1930s. And the story began with a parade, the historic Bud Billiken Parade, which is an annual parade that continues to this day. On a sizzling summer morning in August, our cousin leapt from her bed to find the best spot to view the parade. She joined a crowd that numbered in the thousands, and she cheered as drum majors, baton twirlers, and celebrities in convertibles passed by. She ran out to touch the floats and to touch the parade's anointed king and queen and caught the candy that the participants tossed to her. The parade was a South Side institution, and at a time when racial tensions ran high, when Black families squeezed into overcrowded kitchenettes, and when Black children knew not to venture beyond the boundaries of their neighborhood, the Bud Billiken Parade evoked a deep sense of racial pride, of community and togetherness. For one day a year, Black children could imagine that the city of Chicago was all theirs. So our cousin could not have known that this would be her last time hearing the marching bands and the cheering crowds. Unlike many Black parents, she would not share this experience with her children. She was Black, but she was very light-skinned, and in fact, she looked white. So at the insistence of her mother, after she graduated from high school, she would move far away from Chicago's South Side to Los Angeles to live the rest of her life as a white woman. It was not her choice. She pleaded with her mother. She did not want to leave her family, her friends, and the only life that she had ever known. But her mother was determined, and the matter was decided. Years later, after she married a white man and raised white children who knew nothing of her past, she received a very inconvenient telephone call. It was her mother, and she was calling to tell her that her father was dying and that she must come home immediately. Despite these dire circumstances, she would never return to Chicago's South Side. The young girl who had once sat on a curb in Chicago's most historic Black neighborhood to watch America's largest Black parade was a white woman now, and there was simply no turning back. After my aunt told me this story, it haunted me. So I spent 12 years wrestling with this curious phenomenon of passing. Conventional wisdom tells us that a history of passing cannot be written, that those who passed left no trace in the historical record. But I believed that the sources were out there for historians, just waiting to be discovered. So I went into the archives looking for ghosts, hoping to tell their stories. To find these ghosts, historians must seek out unconventional sources. These sources revealed passing to be a deeply individualistic practice, but also a fundamentally social act with enormous social consequences. The iconic image of the heartbroken yet sympathetic Black mother who must not speak a word nor lay eyes on her white-looking child in public lays bare the painful consequences of this practice. A history of passing cannot be written without telling her story too. Those who were left behind describe the pain and the loss of this act just as keenly as those who passed. So now I'd like to show you a scene from the 1934 version of the famous film Imitation of Life, where we see this problem unfolding, the denial of the darker mother by the lighter child who can pass, and the heartbreak that such a denial causes the mother. And this film is quite interesting. We're going to see a clip that's from earlier in the film where the daughter first rejects the mother, but later in the film, the daughter is played by a Black actress named Freddie Washington. And what's very interesting about this film is that it's one of few films where a Black actress plays the role of the person who's passing as white. Many movie companies felt that there would be greater empathy and greater interest in the film if the character who was passing as white was played by a white actress. And there was also a sense that the films would be more popular and that they would make more money if a white actress was in the lead role. So this is really an unusual film. And it's also unusual because it's early, it's 1934. Okay, so we'll take a look at this scene.
Good afternoon, ma'am. It's raining so hard. I brought rubbers and coat to fetch my little girl home.
I'm afraid you've made some mistake.
Ain't this the 3B?
Yes.
Well, this is it.
It can't be it. I have no little colored children in my class.
Oh, thank you. There's my little girl.
Piola, you may go home.
I didn't know she was colored.
Neither did I.
I hate you. I hate you. I hate you. Viola. Viola.
So later in the film, there's an equally heartbreaking scene where Piola is now older, she's working in a little store, and her mother comes in. Claudette Colbert is also there, so her mother comes in with a white woman, and it's a really heart-wrenching scene because her mother says, you know, why are you doing this? Please, I really want us to be together. And Piola says, you know, I don't know who you are. You know, do I look? And then the manager comes over and says, you know, what's going on? And Piola says, you know, she thinks I'm her daughter. Do I look like I could be her daughter? You know, and so it's a very, very heartbreaking, a similarly heartbreaking scene and a similarly painful scene where she rejects her mother. So passing is often presented as a story of gain. By passing as white, particularly during the years of legalized segregation, one could access a range of employment opportunities that would be otherwise restricted. One could live in a better neighborhood, and one could enjoy countless social privileges. like being addressed as Mr. or Mrs., respectful titles reserved for white men and women only. But my cousin's story and the scene that I've just shown you from Imitation of Life, oops, there we go, oh, sorry. One more ahead. Great, perfect, thank you. So my cousin's story and the scene that I've just shown you from Imitation of Life demonstrates that to write a history of passing is to write a history of loss. The goal of my work is to explore not only what was gained by passing as white, but also what was lost by walking away from a Black identity. Racial passing is an exile, sometimes chosen, sometimes not. From the late 18th century to the present in the United States, countless African Americans passed as white, leaving behind families, friends, communities, and roots. Lives were lost only to be remembered in family stories like mine. So rather than seeing racial identity from the racial regime looking down on those who passed as white, I tried to bring into focus what passers saw as they looked out onto their own worlds. Race was quite real for those who lived with it, not because of skin color or essentialist notions about biology, but because it was social and experiential, because it involved one's closest relationships and one's most intimate communities. Passing often meant striking out on one's own and leaving behind a family and a people. Without a doubt, benefits accrued to these new identities, but a more complete understanding of this practice requires a reckoning with the loss, the alienation, and the isolation that accompanied and often outweighed its rewards. So let me take a step back and offer a broader historical context to my book. Racial passing in the United States is the focus of my project, but it must be acknowledged as only a subset of a much larger phenomenon that encompasses multiple disguises and forms of dissemblance. In the 19th century, as young men and women steadily migrated out of small towns to seek their fortunes in America's booming cities, American Victorians warned that these men and women might pass and enter higher social classes to which they did not belong, given the social fluidity of early 19th century America. While American Victorians were fretting over class passing, Jewish applicants changed their names to outmaneuver discriminatory admissions policies that limited enrollments at universities including Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. Chinese immigrants posed as Mexican and disguised themselves to pass as Mexican and enter the US from the US-Mexico border during the era when the Chinese were excluded from immigrating to the United States. Loretta Vasquez, a Cuban-born woman, passed as a Confederate soldier to fight in the Civil War and entered the ranks of numerous women who joined the military or participated in occupations and activities restricted to men. Gay men passed as straight, also known as putting their hair up, married women, and worked in professions that would have been unavailable to them if they had, quote, let their hair down. Mez Mesro, the flamboyant jazz saxophonist born to Russian Jewish immigrants, passed as black to shore up his musical credentials. So here I have identified only a handful of examples of a sweeping phenomenon to demonstrate its flexibility and its adaptability to various historical contexts. The poor passed as the rich, Women passed as men, Jews passed as Christians, gay men and women passed as straight, and whites sometimes passed as black. And of course, the reverse of each of these dyads was plausible given specific conditions and circumstances. Particularly in societies with relatively open and fluid social orders, the permutations on passing were endless. So now, let me give you just a brief overview of my book, which spans the late 18th century to the mid 20th century. The lived experience of passing, the act of negotiating the permeable border between black and white, reveals one way that everyday people have interacted with a racist society since the late 18th century. Each era determined not only how racially ambiguous men and women lived, but also what they lost. In the antebellum period, enslaved men and women lived with a looming threat of loss, knowing that they could be bought, sold, and forever separated from their families if their master lost a card game or decided to present a slave as a wedding gift. So let me just show you this runaway slave advertisement, which I thought was fascinating because it's actually by Thomas Jefferson. And many of you may know that, very tragically, when Thomas Jefferson died, over 130 of his of the enslaved people who lived at Monticello were dispersed, and they were sold in 1827. Many of them were never able to reconnect with their families. And many of you also know the very interesting history of Thomas Jefferson and his relationship with Sally Hemings and his children and grandchildren, one of whom is documented as passing as white. And many people believe that now many of his children and grandchildren did eventually pass as white. But I wanted to show this advertisement because I think it's kind of interesting about how this person is marked here. This is the right ad. Yes, as a mulatto slave, and how in many slave advertisements and many runaway slave advertisements, the slave owner would be very meticulous about how they described the enslaved person, and would be very clear that this person is very light-skinned. So by saying that this person is a mulatto, trying to alert people that this person is very light-skinned, it's possible that they could pass. In some other advertisements, you might see something like, be aware this enslaved person may present themselves as a free man, as a free woman. Often you also might see something like, may pass himself off as a sailor or as a carpenter, or, something that might alert the person that this person may not look like what you might think an enslaved person would look like. So be aware, be on the lookout for someone who might have free papers or might have other things that might make them less recognizable as an enslaved person. So during the era of slavery, to pass as white was to escape, not necessarily from blackness, but from slavery, and often with the intention of recovering precious relationships and living as black under the more secure conditions of freedom. Passing as white became possible in a society where whiteness was not based solely on appearance, but also on dress, behavior, and mannerisms. Indeed, skin color and physical appearance were usually the least reliable factors. Racially ambiguous slaves drew on highly sophisticated understandings of racial, gender, and social norms to enact whiteness, and by doing so, many successfully passed to freedom. So Ellen Craft passed as a white man, crossing both racial and gender lines to escape to freedom, while her darker-skinned husband played the role of her slave. It was necessary for Ellen to pass as a man because she knew it was highly unconventional for a white woman to travel alone with a male slave. But the Craft's convincing performance required far more than Ellen's white skin. It was Ellen's knowledge of how to dress and comport herself like a Southern gentleman, and her subtle and nuanced understandings of Southern social and gender norms that made this daring undertaking a marvelous success. Concerned that her beardless face might betray her, or that her illiteracy would prevent her from registering her name at hotels, Ellen became a master of improvisation. She bound her right hand in a sling so that she could ask others to sign her name for her. She bandaged her face so that no one would know that she did not have a beard. By feigning illness, disability, and even deafness, Ellen politely excused herself from conversation and won the sympathy of other travelers. In fact, Ellen played the role of a Southern gentleman so well that white Southern ladies reportedly swooned in her presence. So passing to freedom, however, was not nearly as laden with the moral questions and experiences with loss that would follow in later years. During the Jim Crow era, segregated living and working arrangements created the necessary conditions for passing to flourish, but also for this practice to undermine Black families and communities. So as we discussed yesterday, this period also witnessed the Great Migration, the massive and unprecedented migrations of African Americans out of the South that allowed racially ambiguous people to travel and to try on new identities in the anonymity of northern cities. One woman described her grandmother's journey from Mississippi to Chicago. Once in Chicago and no longer immediately identifiable as Lula's daughter, her grandmother could easily enter the white world. This was one of the most common forms of passing during the Jim Crow era, working white while living Black, 9 to 5 passing, as it was often called, which allowed nearly white men and women to access employment slated for whites only. Simply mentioning that a family member held a white-collar job became a shorthand for passing as white, given the strict segregation of employment opportunities. Others passed temporarily or situationally to seek respite from Jim Crow living every now and then. In a 1932 letter to Carl Van Vechten, novelist Nella Larson passed while in the company of another light-skinned woman. And she wrote a letter to Carl Van Vechten about this, and I'll just read it for you. She wrote, "You will be amused that I, who have never tried this much discussed passing stunt, have waited until I reached the Deep South to put it over. Grace Johnson and I drove about 50 miles south of here the other day and then walked to the best restaurant in a rather conservative town called Murfreesboro and demanded lunch and got it, plus all the service in the world and an invitation to return. Everybody seems to think that quite a stunt." So Larson's letter reveals the type of momentary passing that became commonplace in the Jim Crow era, But it also reveals the fun and the theatrics of passing. Convincing performances required gumption, resourcefulness, and no small measure of humor. The sheer joy of getting over and fooling our white folks, as Langston Hughes put it, made passing a means of poking fun at a racial system laden with absurdities about racial purity. So this is an advertisement for the novel from 1929, and this is the recent cover of the Norden critical edition of the novel. So published in 1939, and this is the novel Passing, written by Nella Larson. So published in 1929 at the end of the Harlem Renaissance, Passing is a thrilling, powerful, but tragic novel that explores the intimate friendship between two black women. One of the women is passing as white. The novel is alive with many of the questions that we are wrestling with in our own time: colorism, class differences, desire, sexuality, identity, and belonging. Nella Larson's novel, Passing, begins when these two women, who had been childhood friends, unexpectedly encounter each other on a rooftop of a fancy hotel. And the next few slides that I will show you are taken from the movie Passing, which is based closely, taken from the movie Passing, which is based closely on the novel. So one of the women, Irene Redfield, is bound by middle-class conventions. She is in a loveless but strategic marriage. She prizes her respectable middle-class life and, quote, the manufactured conversations, the soft running sounds of inconsequential talk that fill her life, and her fixed place at the top of black society, unquote. So she will defend this life at all costs. The other woman, Claire Kendry, openly flouts racial norms, not only by passing as white, but also by marrying a white man, seen here, and also by recklessly returning to Harlem on a wild desire to be with her people, with black people, a longing that she describes as an ache and a pain that never ceases. So Claire begs Irene to spend more time with her. Irene feels uneasy by Claire's invitations, but she is also very curious. As Irene explains, quote, there were things that she wanted to ask Claire Kendry. She wished to find out about this hazardous business of passing, this breaking away from all that was familiar and friendly, to take one's chances in another environment, not entirely strange, perhaps, but not entirely friendly either. So Irene knows well that Claire is dangerous, but Irene's feelings for Claire, especially Irene's sexual desire for Claire, are far more alarming. Irene also worries that her husband may be in love with Claire, which would threaten the picture-perfect life that Irene has worked so hard to build. So the reader can feel that this novel will not end happily. Irene's desperation, her knowledge of her husband's deep unhappiness, and her desire for some measure of control over her life will lead her to act dangerously, impulsively, and even murderously. Nella Larson seems to suggest that there are no available avenues for women like Claire Kendry or Irene Redfield, and perhaps this is why her novels end in tragedy. These black women are suffocating. They are strangled by an inflexible and unforgiving racial and gender regime. Okay, so let me now return to the historical context of passing and the ways that the phenomenon of passing was shaped by particular time periods. Walter White, the racially ambiguous executive secretary of the NAACP, made a practice of putting his blonde hair and blue eyes to use to enter the South during the 1920s to investigate lynching. White must have laughed nervously when he sat next to a white man on a train who bragged that he had special expertise in identifying blacks who passed as white. Taking White's hand into his own and pointing at White's cuticles, the white man explained that if White had black blood, it would show up on his fingernails, which was an antiquated belief about a telltale sign of black racial identity. In a country obsessed with racial distinctions, passing demonstrated just how unreliable one's appearance was in determining their race. So at times, passing was a practical joke at the expense of whites, but this levity must not obscure the high emotional stakes, the threats to familial coherence, and the personal pain that this practice necessitated. One of the most heartrending stories of passing that I discovered in the archives is that of Elsie Roxborough, who was born to a storied African-American family who actually lived in Detroit. She chose to pass as white after she graduated from the University of Michigan in 1937. Her story ends in tragedy. She took her own life in 1949. During the Depression, the Roxborough family lived a life that few Americans, black or white, could have imagined. They had maids and chauffeurs. Elsie rode horses and drove her father's cars. The family vacationed with other black elites at Idlewild, a lakefront resort in western Michigan nicknamed the Black Eden. Novelist and poet Langston Hughes wrote that Elsie would, quote, tell him her dreams and wonder whether or not it would be better for her to pass as white to achieve them. After college, Elsie moved to New York. She dyed her brown hair red and dropped the famous Roxborough name to become the unattached white Mona Manet. But even as a white woman, her dreams would not come true. And this is a picture of Elsie when she was passing as white. When Elsie's white roommate returned from a weekend trip, she found Elsie in her bed. It appeared that Elsie had committed suicide. Her sister, who could also pass as white, traveled to New York with the wrenching assignment of claiming the body. The arrival of this ostensibly white woman allowed Elsie to remain white, even in death. Elsie had written to her father for financial help. He refused her, and 3 days later, she was dead. Her sister would never speak to her father again. Now, by the 1940s and through the 1960s, personal testimonies began to declare that the losses were simply too much to bear, and it was time to give up passing and come home. The black press published numerous testimonials of African Americans who disavowed passing and cataloged the countless psychological advantages of embracing a black identity. Many articles cheerfully announced the collapse of economic barriers after World War II that seemed to make 9-to-5 passing no longer necessary. Other essays focused on the collective pride that African Americans experienced and the growing protest spirit of the burgeoning civil rights movement. The Johnston family, shown here in their suburban home in Keene, New Hampshire, passed for 20 years before they were discovered. The father, a successful and well-respected radiologist, applied to be an officer in the Navy during World War II. A naval background check revealed that he had been in a black fraternity during college. Oops. So I guess a note to self, if you plan to pass, you might not want to join a black fraternity. But after the family's secret was revealed, they insisted that they were through with passing and that they would never pass again. Now, by the 1960s, racial politics had changed once again. Black identities were affirmed and passing was rejected. Black was beautiful. Blending in with the white world seemed no longer economically necessary, politically advantageous, or socially desirable. So I am often asked, do people still pass today? And many of you may remember the story of Rachel Dolezal, which made national news in June of 2015. She claimed that she was black and had identified as black even as a child, though her parents insisted that she was in fact white. More recently, Jessica Krug, an associate professor of history at George Washington University, posted a confession on the platform Medium, explaining that she was not who she had been claiming to be. As she explained, quote, "To an escalating degree over my adult life, I have eschewed my lived experience as a white Jewish child in suburban Kansas City within a blackness that I had no right to claim." So I am certain that passing continues, but probably in very different forms than what I have described in my talk. We now live in a far more multiracial society than Ellen Craft or Elsie Roxborough could have imagined. The conditions of the 21st century allow for a greater acceptance of mixed race identities. But still, many of the core issues of race and identity remain. Each generation must navigate the social currents and racial realities of their time period. A history of passing opens a window on the complexity of the human experience. It allows us to gain a deeper and more meaningful understanding of the ways that race is lived and experienced. I hope that telling the history of passing can lead to a deeper understanding of the human condition and the universality of the experience of loss. Some African Americans use passing as a crucial channel, leading to physical and personal freedom. They declared their rights as American citizens and insisted on their humanity. What they could not have fully known until they had successfully passed was that the light of freedom was often overshadowed by the darkness of loss. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We're going to move now on to the questions. I have a few from yesterday that I will begin with, but in the meantime, I think my colleagues will walk around and see if there are additional questions to add to the mix. And I will add that if we don't get through all of them now, this afternoon at 4 o'clock under the tent, we'll be able to continue. So let me get back to that first question.
Yes, a wonderful question. I'm really glad that we're going to talk about that.
So the question was, when you say people pass who are actually African American, how are you defining African Americans?
So that's a wonderful question and something that I really wanted to be very clear about. So in my book, I am very straightforward in explaining that I would not want to make that decision. I would not want to impose an identity on any person, because I think that part of my research is trying to show is that we all have identities, and often other people do sort of make assumptions about our identities, that our identities are often not our own. So what I did in my research was I only focused on people who identified themselves as African American and then talked about intentionally passing as white. So I didn't sort of put an identity on any of my research, any of the figures in my book, but rather I looked at people who said, who identified as Black, like someone like Elsie Roxborough, who lived most of her life as Black, felt her, imagined, like knew herself to be Black, or at least that's the way she saw herself and presented herself, and then kind of made this very clear and very intentional decision to pass as white. So hopefully that makes sense, that I wanted to be very careful that I didn't make any assumptions, because part of my book is an effort to say that we should allow each person to define themselves and to make those decisions about their identities on their own, even though we know that society will often try to impose certain identities on different people.
Great. Well, this question is similar. It's on the theme of identity, so why don't we go with that? And since it really, I think, is a nice segue from what you just said. What model or models of identity would you encourage us to explore? Or, perhaps more easily answered, what models of identity have been useful to your work?
That's a great question. I think one thing that I struggled with in my work, or that I've really thought about after publishing the book, has been sort of thinking about passing much more broadly and much more widely. I wanted to write about Black to white passing because I think it's probably the most kind of recognizable form of passing, particularly in the United States, given how segregated our society has been, given how passing was almost a kind of way of, like, a lot of the subjects in my book talk about crossing over, or about really having to leave behind a Black identity, a Black family, in order to join in order to pass as white. It's often seen as almost like a death. So I felt that it was really important to write about Black to white passing, just because it seemed like a subject that hadn't gotten a lot of attention in terms of history, that there hadn't been another historical book about passing from Black to white. But as I thought about identity and as I was writing about identity, I was thinking, there's so many ways that we all pass. Every day, you could imagine that someone thinks that you're something that you may not identify as, or, you just might be recognized in some way that is not really the way that you see yourself. I had a story about class passing where I lived in this, when I was in graduate school, I lived in a very tiny little cottage. Or I shouldn't say cottage, because here that has a very different meaning. So I should say I lived in a pool house, and it was a little tiny pool house, And it was on the property of this amazing, enormous mansion. And I would always have my students over for the last class, and this time the students came, a bus driver brought them over, and the bus driver was African American, and they pull up and they see this giant mansion, and I come out to meet them, and the bus driver has tears in his eyes, and he takes my hand and he says, "I never thought that I would see a young black woman," at the time I was younger than I am now, I never thought that I would see a young black woman living in a house like this. And I thought, well, should I tell him that time still has not come, and that I live in the pool house, you know? But so I guess what I would say in answer to that question is that I think if I were going to write a book now about passing, there would be so many more identities that I would want to talk about. I mean, I would want to talk more about gender. I would want to talk more about sexual orientation. I mean, I think that the idea of sexuality and sexual identity has, you know, in the last several years, we're talking about it in new ways, and it's expanding in new ways, and we're thinking, you know, less about binaries than we once were. I'd want to talk about citizenship and the ways that we might that some people might pass as citizens who are perhaps undocumented. And I mean, I just think that our society has become much more diverse and much more complex when it comes to identity. So, you know, I think that if I were going to write a book now, it would be much, much longer. And, you know, I would still want to kind of keep that issue of black and white passing sort of at the center, because I really think that it really does speak to one of the major divisions in our society, and one of the most kind of historical divisions in our society, given the history of slavery. But yeah, I think there's a lot of identities that would need to factor into the book.
Great, thank you. Well, I think for probably our last question, we will continue on this theme of identity, because we've got such great questions from the audience on this issue. And building off of what you just said about the book that you would write about passing, where you had the opportunity to do it again or do it in the future, what about what you are currently doing right now, which is teaching? And the question is, could you give us some recommendations for accessible discussion of the question of identity, the sort of books or articles your undergrads are reading in your class? What would you assign us to read on these issues?
What a great question. What a great question. You know, I actually think that the best books on identity are actually fiction. I think that there's a way that fiction allows a kind of deeper interpretation of identity. It allows us to maybe feel what someone is experiencing. I mean, I think that's so true about Nella Larson and her book, Passing, which was published in 1929. I think many of the issues that she raises in that book are still so relevant today, almost 100 years later. I think film is another great source. So I kind of started with literature and film when I started my work, because when I first started, you know, a lot of people said, "Oh, you're never going to find anything, so, you know, forget that idea, move on to something else." And so I thought, well, let me start where I know there's discussions of identity, and that was in literature and film. And I was able to really kind of get a deeper sense of identity, of the kinds of issues that people are experiencing. And then, interestingly, many of the authors who wrote about passing and wrote about identity, then in their archives talked about their own experiences with identity or with passing. So I would say Nella Larson is a great person to look at. I would say the films about passing are fantastic. There are some sociologists who have written about passing. There's a great sociologist named Rogers Brubaker who has a book called Trans, where he talks about identity. There's also an article that he's written called Beyond Identity, where he talks about how identity is such a kind of complicated word that's maybe used too often. Maybe we should come up with other words rather than kind of describing everything as identity. So I actually think that almost there's so much on identity, especially now, especially as we all are thinking about our identities, especially in the ways that identity is becoming much wider, I think, much broader, in the ways that, you know, we could talk about how just in the last year, how things that we might not have thought about being related to one's identity have become part of one's identity. So for example, whether someone decided to get vaccinated for COVID, all of a sudden that became kind of a part of their identity. So I think there's lots of ways of thinking about identity. It's such a rich topic.
And one of the things I really loved about what you're saying in the references to literature and film was also to look into the archives of the writers themselves,
Right.
and what produced that artifact. I think that's really great. And to your point, a number of audience members brought up works like Black Like Me and The Vanishing Half.
The Vanishing Half,
which we
yes.
could maybe talk about at 4 o'clock. But in any case, I think our esteemed chairman has a question.
Only, Professor Hobbs, would you tell us what to expect tomorrow? What do you expect to talk about?
Oh, sure. So tomorrow I'm going to talk about a book that I am working on now, which is about the American road trip, which is something that I just am kind of fascinated by. And I'm trying to look at it through the lens of African Americans. So I think we really idealize the American road trip, and it's something that we all kind of probably have enjoyed. And I'm looking at it to see how, when we take this kind of iconic American experience and we look at it through the eyes of African American motorists, how does the idea of the road trip change? So that's what I'll be talking about tomorrow. Great, thank you.